All right, so on to the next one. All right, this is called Alexander and the Garden, as written by Nicole Dodd. Alexander had always been a cowardly boy, but now he stood over the deep, dark cave below, thinking of all the times he'd wished he could be brave. And now he had been. But before we get to that part of the story, let's start from the beginning. In a land where nothing ever seemed sad or droopy, and the sun shined bright every day, there lived a young boy. This young boy was a prince, whose name was Alexander. Alexander loved to play in his castle gardens. Every day he'd wake up, eat breakfast, and go outside. But there was one corner of the garden that Alexander never dared to play in. This because this part of the garden had never seen sunlight. No matter how bright or high the sun was, a permanent shadow sat over the garden's edge. One day, Alexander was on his way outside, but as he walked through the door, he saw something small scamper through the grass and disappear into the dark corner. Alexander thought to himself for a moment and pondered what he could have been that he saw. Eventually, he let it go and went about his day. Later that night, he was lying in bed, again thinking of the thing he had seen in the garden. Just as he was about to close his eyes, he saw something move outside through the window. He jumped up and curiously peeked out the window, trying to stay hidden. Then he saw it. A tiny gnome, about the size of his head, scurried through the garden and ran to the corner. Alexander grabbed his candle and ran through the halls and out the door that leads to the garden. He crouched behind a tall oak tree and again waited to see the gnome. Alexander waited and waited until his eyes drooped and his hand could no longer hold up his candle. Alexander stood and made his way back to his room. But Alexander would not give up. Every night for the next 3 days he returned and crouched behind the oak tree. On the fourth night, Alexander began to lose hope. Again he crouched behind the tree and waited, until finally the gnome poked its head out from the dark corner and ran to the castle's door. Alexander waited a few seconds just to make sure the gnome was gone and ran towards the corner of the garden. The edge of the garden surprised Alexander. Although it looked small from the outside, Alexander stared to what seemed to be an entire forest. Alexander took a deep breath and stepped deeper into the forest. Trees and plants and things Alexander didn't even know existed filled the space around him. Alexander couldn't help but be awestruck. But soon after he heard a noise. At first the noise was small, like an animal stepping on twigs. But the noise grew louder and louder, until all he could hear was the sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching. He tried to run, but tripped over a tree trunk. The forest grew wilder and wilder around him until he could no longer see the castle garden. Alexander shut his eyes and ran, trying to get as far away from the noise as possible. He ran for what seemed like hours, until finally he ran into a large wall, or at least what looked like a wall. Alexander walked around the wall and soon discovered that the wall was a doorway. He peered through and squinted, noticing a long set of stairs going deep underground. That's when he realized that in his excitement of seeing the gnome again, he had left his candle in the garden, and it was getting very, very late. Alexander knew there was no place he would get back to the candle before sunrise, so he began looking for a place to sleep. Alexander searched and searched, but it seemed the forest had been made for an insomniac. Trees were too thin to climb, the leaves too brittle to sleep on. Finally, Alexander rested inside the doorway, hoping the stone walls would offer protection against the cold fall air. Alexander woke with the rising sun, feeling the warmth hit his skin. Compared to the night before, the weather seemed perfect. A light breeze blew leaves around, and bird-like melodies drifted through the air. The forest seemed even more beautiful now than the sun was out. But still, Alexander was desperate to get out. His whole life he had been pampered, but now he sat with a scraped knee and a rumbling stomach. Alexander walked most of the day away, and as the sun set he returned to the stone doorway. He thought to himself for a moment and decided that even though he normally wouldn't have, he would walk down the set of stone stairs. Now that we're all caught up, let's get back to the present. Alexander stood over the cave, deciding what he was going to do. He couldn't go back up to the forest, and he hadn't seen any other pathways down, so the cave seemed his only option. Alexander took a few steps back, prepared himself, and jumped into the cave. But as soon as he jumped, he knew he regretted it. The cave seemed to go on for miles, and Alexander felt as if he would never stop falling. And even if he did, he wasn't sure it would turn out well. But then Alexander landed on a soft, pillowy cushion. Confused, he looked around and wondered what had broken his fall. Alexander was laying on the bed that resembled a bird's nest, which was full of huge white feathers. He crawled out and looked around the cave, excited and scared to explore. The cave was huge. It had tall ceilings and so many paths you could get lost if you didn't pay attention. There were stacks of wood piled up near the wall, and a separate pile of feathers close to the ones in the bird's nest. There was also a dim candle-like light, but no matter where Alexander looked, he could not find the source. After wondering for a few minutes, he began to look for a way out. Alexander searched every nook and cranny of the cave, but no way out appeared to him. He made his way back to the bird's nest and sat down. He thought to himself about how hungry and scared he was, and if he would make it back home. Alexander began to feel a wave of sleepiness wash over him and settled into the bed nest. He rolled over and tried to get as comfortable as possible. The bed was surprisingly warm. For the first time in a day, Alexander fell asleep comfortably and warm. But soon after he awoke to the sound of footsteps not far off. He quickly began searching for the source and saw a shadow moving closer to him. The shadow grew bigger and bigger as it rounded the corner of one of the many passages in the cave. Alexander felt goosebumps pop around his arm, and the hair on the back of his neck stood up. He shut his eyes and prayed whatever was coming towards him wasn't a monster like the ones he had read about in the library. But as soon as Alexander saw the creature, he began to laugh. A tiny gnome, smaller than the one he had seen in the garden, stood a few feet away from him and blinked its big, bug-like eyes. How could he have been scared of something so cute and tiny? The gnome motioned for Alex to follow him and began walking back from where he came. Alexander jumped up and began to follow, hoping the gnome was leading him back home. The gnome walked down a pathway and another pathway, seeming to know exactly where they were going, but it seemed as if they would never reach their destination. Finally, the gnome led him into a room, twice the size of the room with the bird's nest. Holes not much bigger than the gnome itself lined the walls, and the candlelight seemed twice as bright here. Thousands of tiny gnomes sat around the room at tables on the floor, and in the holes Alexander looked around but couldn't spot the gnomes he had saw from 5 days ago. The tiny gnome led him deeper into the room and down another hallway. The hallway opened up into a small office-like room. 3 other gnomes sat down at a badly built wooden table, waiting for Alexander to arrive. The gnome that led him here patted an open seat and sat down himself. The seat was half Alexander's size, but as he sat down anyway, the gnomes explained to Alexander they had been leaving the forest in search of food inside the castle. Normally, the forest provided all the food they could want and more, but recently the forest's food supplies began to dwindle, so they needed Alexander's help to find out why. Alexander agreed to help them, but only on the condition that afterwards they would help him get back home. The next day, Alexander and the gnomes set out to fix their food problem. They walked through parts of the garden that Alexander had never seen before, although it seemed as if he'd walked the whole forest when he was looking for the way out. As they walked through the forest, they heard a noise nearby. The gnomes, whom evidently were easily scared creatures, ran in all different directions, causing a flurry of leaves to fly through the air. But Alexander stayed put. He had let his cowardice lead him for too long. He waited patiently for the noise again, and darted towards it in the second he was determined where it was coming from. What Alexander saw shocked him. A huge monster with big horns and sharp claws lay against a rock, snoring loudly. This had to be the reasons the gnome couldn't find food. Imagine feeding this thing. Alexander ran to find the gnomes, to tell them what he had found. When he and the gnomes got back to the cave, they discussed what they could do to get rid of this monster. A few hours later, Alexander had an idea that they would set up a trap and carry the monster to the part of the forest away from the gnomes. The next day, Alexander sent a few gnomes to watch over the monster and see what it did during the day and if it moved spots. They discovered that the monster slept during the day and hunted for food at night, and always slept in the same spot. So the next night, while the monster hunter, they set up their trap. First, they dug a deep, wide hole, filled it halfway with leaves, and then placed a net on top of the hole and covered it with mud and leaves and twigs. Alexander took a step back, marveling at how well they hid the trap. You could hardly see it. Now they just had to wait. The next day they came back to the trap and noticed that something had been caught. The gnomes jumped around and shouted, "Hooray, hooray!" But Alexander had a bad feeling. He checked the trap, and indeed he caught the monster. But he also noticed something he hadn't seen before. The monster was pregnant. Alexander knew he had to save the monster, but the gnomes would never let him. He came back later that night and saw the monster clawing on the rope, trying to get out. Alexander felt guilt washed over him. He grabbed a branch sharpened by the cave and cut a hole in the rope. The monster crawled out and guided Alexander away. Alexander spent the whole night caring for the monster, and his actions rewarded him. Turns out the monster knew how to get back to the kingdom's garden and agreed to help Alexander the next day. And as Alexander fell asleep, he thought to himself, once he was out of the forest, he was going to take a break from all this bravery stuff. That was Alexander and the Garden, as written by Nicole Dodd. And so far, I haven't crashed. It has been a little feisty with this most recent update. So, yeah, I'm getting that too. Not sure why. All right. If Mondo is still awake, this next one is for her. Now you're still, you are still awake. Nope. Nope. No, it's completely from me. Nope, this was me, but I'm doing it just for you because you had mentioned this at one point. All right, this one is pretty short but fun. The cats nestle close to their kittens now. The llama have laid down with their sheep. You're cozy and warm in your bed, my dear. Please go the fuck to sleep. The windows are dark in the town, child. The whales huddle down in the deep. I read you one very last book if you swear you'll go the fuck to sleep. The eagles soar through the sky are at rest, and the creatures who crawled run and creep. I know you're not thirsty. That's bullshit. Stop lying. Lie the fuck down, my darling, and sleep. The wind whispers soft through the grass, hun. The mice, they make not a peep. It's been 38 minutes already. Jesus Christ, what the fuck? Go to sleep. All the kids from daycare are in dreamland. The froggy has made his last leap. Hell no, you can't go to the bathroom. You know where you can go? The fuck to sleep. The owls fly forth from the treetops. Through the air they soar and they sweep. A hot crimson rage fills my heart, love. For real, shut the fuck up and sleep. The cubs and the lions are snoring, wrapped in a big, snuggly heap. How is it you can do all this other great shit, but not lie down and lie the fuck down and go to sleep? The seeds slumber beneath the earth now, and the crops and the farmers will reap. No more questions. The interview's over. I've got 2 words for you, kid. Fucking sleep. The tiger reclines in the swimming jungle. The sparrow has silenced her cheep. Fuck your stuffed bear. I'm not getting you shit. Close your eyes, cut the crap, and sleep. The flowers doze low in the meadows, and high in the mountains no steep. My life is a failure. I'm a shitty-ass parent. Stop fucking with me, and please, please sleep. The giant pangolins of Madagascar are snoozing. As I lie here and openly weep. Sure, fine, whatever, I'll bring you some milk. Who the fuck cares? You're not going to sleep. This room is all I can remember. The furniture is crappy and cheap. You win, you escape. You run down the hall as I nod the fuck off and sleep. Bleary and dazed I awaken to find your eyes shut, so I keep my fingers crossly tight as I tiptoe away and pray that you're fucking asleep. We're finally watching our movie. Popcorn's in the microwave, beep. Oh shit, god damn it, you've got to be kidding. Come on, go the fuck back to sleep. That is Go the Fuck to Sleep as written by Adam Mansbach. It was hard to keep a straight face for that. I did not at all. I thought you would enjoy that one.